Chapter 2, Part 2 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 2, Part 2. I would select one episode only from the journals as an example of the peculiarity and the sternness of Charles Gordon's character, his behavior towards Slatin. This Austrian officer had been governor of Darfur with the rank in the Egyptian service of Bey. For 4 years he had struggled vainly against the rebellion. He had fought numerous engagements with varied success. He had been several times wounded. Throughout his province and even beyond its limits, he bore the reputation of a brave and capable soldier. The story of his life of suffering and adventure, written by himself, is widely known, and he is thought by those who have read it to be a man of feeling and of honor. By those who enjoy his personal acquaintance, this belief is unhesitatingly confirmed. He had, however, committed an act which deprived him of Gordon's sympathy and respect. During the fighting in Darfur, after several defeats, his Mohammedan soldiers were discouraged and attributed their evil fortune to the fact that their commander was an infidel under the curse of the Almighty. Slatin therefore proclaimed himself a follower of the Prophet, and outwardly at least adopted the faith of Islam. The troops, delighted at his conversion and cheered by the hope of success, renewed their efforts, and the resistance of the governor of Darfur was prolonged. The end, however, was deferred, not averted. After the destruction of General Hicks's army, Slatin was compelled to surrender to the dervishes. The religion he had assumed to secure victory, he observed to escape death. The Arab leaders, who admired his courage, treated him at first with respect and kindness, and he was conducted to the Mahdi in his encampment before Khartoum. There, during the siege, he remained, closely watched but not imprisoned. Thence he wrote letters to Gordon explaining his surrender, excusing his apostasy, and begging that he might be allowed, not even assisted, to escape to Khartoum. The letters are extant, and scarcely anyone who reads them, reflecting on the 12 years of danger and degradation that lay before this man, will refuse their compassion. Gordon was inflexible. Before the arrival of the letters, his allusions to Slatin are contemptuous. One cannot help being amused at the Mahdi carrying all the Europeans about with him. Nuns, priests, Greeks, Austrian officers. What a medley, a regular état-major, from the journals at Khartoum. He is suspicious of the circumstances of his surrender. The Greek says Slatin had 4,000 ardebs of Dura, 1,500 cows, and plenty of ammunition. He had been given 8 horses by the Mahdi. He will not vouch for such a man, but he adds with characteristic justice, all this information must be taken with reserve. At length the letters came. At the peril of his life, when ordered to write and demand the surrender of the town, Slatin substituted an appeal to Gordon to countenance his escape. This is the uncompromising minute in the journals. October 16. The letters of Slatin have arrived. I have no remarks to make on them, and cannot make out why he wrote them. In the afternoon, indeed, he betrays some pity, but it is the pity of a man for a mouse. He is evidently not a Spartan. He will want some quarantine. One feels sorry for him. The next day he is again inexorable, and gives his reasons clearly. I shall have nothing to do with Slatin's coming here to stay, unless he has the Mahdi's positive leave, which he is not likely to get. His doing so would be the breaking of his parole, which should be as sacred when given to the Mahdi as to any other power, and it would jeopardize the safety of all these Europeans, prisoners with Mahdi. Slatin's position, it should be observed, was not that of an officer released on parole, but of a prisoner of war in durance, in the enemy's camp. In such circumstances he was clearly entitled to escape at his own proper risk. If his captors gave him the chance, they had only themselves to blame. His position was not dissimilar from that of the black soldiers who had been captured by the dervishes and were now made to serve against the government. These deserted to Khartoum daily, and the general fully acquiesced in their doing so. As to Slatin's escape affecting the treatment of the other European prisoners, it must be observed that when at various times escapes were effected from Omdurman, and ultimately when Slatin himself escaped, no ill treatment was inflicted on the rest of the prisoners, and even had such ill treatment been the certain consequence of an escape, that need not have debarred a man, according to the customs of war, from attempting to regain his liberty. Nothing but his free and formal promise, obtained in return for favors received, can alienate that right. If the Mahdi chose to slaughter the remaining prisoners, the responsibility rested with the Mahdi. Slatin was, however, in no position to argue his case. His correspondence with Gordon was discovered. For some days his life hung on a thread. For several months he was heavily chained and fed on a daily handful of uncooked doura, such as is given to horses and mules. Tidings of these things were carried to Gordon. "Slatin," he observes icily, "is still in chains." He never doubted the righteousness of the course he had adopted, never for an instant, but few will deny that there were strong arguments on both sides. Many will assert that they were nicely balanced. Gordon must have weighed them carefully. He never wavered. Yet he needed Slatin. He was alone. He had no one in whose military capacity he could put the slightest confidence. Again and again in the journals he expresses his want of trustworthy subordinates. He could not be everywhere, he said. "Nearly every order has to be repeated 2 or 3 times. I am weary of my life. What one has felt so much here is the want of men like Gessi, or Mesegdalia, or Slatin, but I have no one to whom I could entrust expeditions." This was the man who would have employed Zubehr and bowed to expediency, but Zubehr had never denied his lord. The actual defense of Khartoum is within the province of the journals, nor shall I attempt a chronological account. After the 10th of September, when General Gordon sent Colonel Stewart and Messrs. Power and Herbin down the river in the ill-fated Abbas steamer, he was altogether alone. Many men have bowed to the weight of responsibility. Gordon's responsibility was undivided. There was no one to whom he could talk as an equal. There was no one to whom he could, as to a trusty subordinate, reveal his doubts. To some minds the exercise of power is pleasant, but few sensations are more painful than responsibility without control. The general could not supervise the defense. The officers robbed the soldiers of their rations. The sentries slumbered at their posts. The townspeople bewailed their misfortunes, and all ranks and classes intrigued with the enemy in the hope of securing safety when the town should fall. Frequent efforts were made to stir up the inhabitants or sap their confidence. Spies of all kinds pervaded the town. The Egyptian pashas, despairing, meditated treason. Once an attempt was made to fire the magazine. Once no less than 80,000 ardebs of grain were stolen from the arsenal. From time to time the restless and ceaseless activity of the commander might discover some plot and arrest the conspirators, or, checking some account, might detect some robbery. But he was fully aware that what he found out was scarcely a tithe of what he could not hope to know. The Egyptian officers were untrustworthy, yet he had to trust them. The inhabitants were thoroughly broken by war, and many were disloyal. He had to feed and inspirit them. The town itself was scarcely defensible. It must be defended to the end. From the flat roof of his palace his telescope commanded a view of the forts and lines. Here he would spend the greater part of each day, scrutinizing the defenses and the surrounding country with his powerful glass. When he observed that the sentries on the forts had left their posts, he would send over to have them flogged and their superiors punished. When his penny steamers engaged the dervish batteries, he could watch on tenterhooks a combat which might be fatal to the defense, but which, since he could not direct it, it must be left to officers by turns timid and reckless, and in the dark hours of the night he could not even watch. The journals, the only receptacle of his confidences, display the bitterness of his sufferings no less than the greatness of his character. "There is no contagion," he writes, "equal to that of fear. I have been rendered furious when from anxiety I could not eat. I would find those at the same table were in like manner affected." To the military anxieties was added every kind of worry which may weary a man's soul. The women clamored for bread. The townsfolk heaped reproaches upon him. The quarrel with the British government had cut him very deeply. The belief that he was abandoned and discredited, that history would make light of his efforts, would perhaps never know of them, filled his mind with a sense of wrong and injustice which preyed upon his spirits. The miseries of the townsfolk wrung his noble, generous heart. The utter loneliness depressed him, and over all lay the shadow of uncertainty. To the very end, the possibility that all might be well mocked him with false hopes. The first light of any morning might reveal the longed-for steamers of relief and the uniforms of British soldiers. He was denied even the numbing anesthetic of despair. Yet he was sustained by two great moral and mental stimulants: his honor as a man, his faith as a Christian. The first had put all courses which he did not think right once and for all out of the question, and so allayed many doubts and prevented many vain regrets. But the second was the real source of his strength. He was sure that beyond this hazardous existence, with all its wrongs and inequalities, another life awaited him, a life which, if he had been faithful and true here upon earth, would afford him greater faculties for good and wider opportunities for their use. "Look at me now," he once said to a fellow traveler, "with small armies to command and no cities to govern. I hope that death will set me free from pain, and that great armies will be given me, and that I shall have vast cities under my command." From Lieutenant Colonel N. Newham Davis, some Gordon reminiscences published in the Man of the World newspaper, December 14, 1898. Such was his bright hope of immortality. As the severity of military operations increases, so also must the sternness of discipline. The zeal of the soldiers, their warlike instincts, and the interests and excitements of war may ensure obedience of orders and the cheerful endurance of perils and hardships during a short and prosperous campaign. But when fortune is dubious or adverse, when retreats as well as advances are necessary, when supplies fail, arrangements miscarry, and disasters impend, and when the struggle is protracted, men can only be persuaded to accept evil things by the lively realization of the fact that greater terrors await their refusal. The ugly truth is revealed that fear is the foundation of obedience. It is certain that the influence of General Gordon upon the garrison and townspeople of Khartoum owed its greatest strength to that sinister element. "It is quite painful," he writes in his journals in September, "to see men tremble so when they come and see me, that they cannot hold the match to their cigarette." Yet he employed all other methods of inspiring their efforts. As the winter drew on, the sufferings of the besieged increased, and their faith in their commander and his promises of relief diminished. To preserve their hopes, and by their hopes their courage and loyalty, was beyond the power of man. But what a great man in the utmost exercise of his faculties and authority might do, Gordon did. His extraordinary spirit never burned more brightly than in these last gloomy days. The money to pay the troops was exhausted. He issued notes, signing them with his own name. The citizens groaned under the triple scourge of scarcity, disease, and war. He ordered the bands to play merrily and discharged rockets. It was said that they were abandoned, that help would never come, that the expedition was a myth, the lie of a general who was disavowed by his government. Forthwith he placarded the walls with the news of victories and of the advance of a triumphant British army, or hired all the best houses by the river's bank for the accommodation of the officers of the relieving force. A dervish shell crashed through his palace. He ordered the date of its arrival to be inscribed above the whole. For those who served him faithfully, he struck medals and presented them with pomp and circumstance. others less laudable, he shot. And by all these means and expedients, the defense of the city was prolonged through the summer, autumn, and winter of 1884 and on into the year 1885. All this time, the public anxiety in England had been steadily growing. If Gordon was abandoned, he was by no means forgotten. As his mission had been followed with intense interest throughout the whole country, so its failure had caused general despondency. Disappointment soon gave place to alarm. The subject of the personal safety of the distinguished envoy was first raised in the House of Commons on the 16th of March by Lord Randolph Churchill. Availing himself of the opportunities provided by supply, he criticized the vacillating policy of the government, their purposeless slaughter in the eastern Sudan, and their failure to establish the Suakin-Berber route. He proceeded to draw attention to the perilous position of General Gordon at Khartoum. Colonel Courtligan has stated that Khartoum may be easily captured. We know that General Gordon is surrounded by hostile tribes and cut off from communications with Cairo and London. And under these circumstances, the House has a right to ask Her Majesty's government whether they are going to do anything to relieve him. Are they going to remain indifferent to the fate of the one man on whom they have counted to extricate them from their dilemmas, to leave him to shift for himself and not make a single effort on his behalf? From Hansard's Parliamentary Debates, March 16, 1884. The government remained impassive. Lord E. Fitzmaurice made some sort of reply, and there were ministerial cheers. But the subject, once raised, was not allowed to drop. Inspired and animated by the earnest energy of a young man, the opposition were continually growing stronger. The conduct of Egyptian affairs afforded ample opportunity for criticism and attack. All through the summer months and almost every night, ministers were invited to declare whether they would rescue their envoy or leave him to his fate. Mr. Gladstone returned evasive answers. The conservative press took the cue. The agitation became intense. Even among the supporters of the government there was dissatisfaction. But the Prime Minister was obdurate and unflinching. At length, at the end of the session, the whole matter was brought forward in the gravest and most formal way by the moving of a vote of censure. The debate that followed Sir Michael Hicks Beech's motion was long and acrimonious. Mr. Gladstone's speech only increased the disquietude of his followers and the fury of the opposition. Mr. Forster openly declared his disagreement with his leader, and although Lord Hartington, in winding up the debate, threw out some hopes of an expedition in the autumn, the government majority fell on the division to 28. And after the prorogation, the controversy was carried on with undiminished vigor outside the walls of Parliament, and the clamor in the country grew louder and louder. It is usual to look upon Mr. Gladstone's conduct in the matter of the relief of Gordon as dictated by benevolent weakness. History may take another view. Strong and stubborn as was the character of the general, that of the minister was its equal. If Gordon was the better man, Gladstone was incomparably the greater. It was easy for the first minister of the Crown to dispatch an expedition against savages. He was accustomed to the exercise of power. Compared with the resources of the empire, the enterprise was insignificant. Few men have feared responsibility less than Gladstone. On the other hand, the expressed desire of the nation was a force to which he had always bowed, to which indeed he owed his political existence. Yet, in spite of the growing agitation throughout the land, he remained stern and silent. Most men do what is right, or what they persuade themselves is right, nor is it difficult to believe that Mr. Gladstone did not feel justified in involving the nation in operations in the heart of the Sudan for the purpose not of saving the life of the envoy, for Gordon had but to embark on his steamers and come home, but simply in order to vindicate the personal honor of a man. And it is possible that a feeling of resentment against the officer whose intractable nature was bringing such odium upon the government may have colored his resolution with a darker tinge. but for all his power and influence he was forced to give way. The government, which had long ignored the call of honor abroad, was driven to the Sudan by the cries of shame at home. Lord Hartington, at that time Secretary of State for War, must be dissociated from the general censure which his principal colleagues have incurred. He was the first to recognize the obligation which lay upon the Cabinet, and through the Cabinet upon the nation, and it was to his influence that the dispatch of the relieving expedition was mainly due. The Commander-in-Chief and the Adjutant-General, who were fully alive to the critical position at Khartoum, added their recommendations. But even at the last moment Mr. Gladstone was induced to sanction the advance only by the belief that the scale of the operations would be small, and that only a single brigade would be necessary. The decision was taken forthwith by the Ministry and announced to the nation. The Adjutant General, however, asked for a very different force from what the government had anticipated, and the single brigade was expanded into an expedition of 10,000 men, selected from the whole army. To reverse the decision was now, however, impossible, and the Gordon Relief Expedition began. The commander to whom the conduct of the operations had been entrusted reviewed the situation. He saw himself confronted with a task which was easy and safe if it were undertaken at leisure, and which was doubtful and perilous if begun in haste. All the fruits of a long and successful career were staked on the result, and it is scarcely wonderful that he declined to be swift and reckless. Shrewdly estimating the military difficulties, he made his plans for a methodical and deliberate advance which would leave nothing to luck, and which resembles in character that afterwards carried out by Sir H. Kitchener. He excluded the idea of a wild, glorious rush which might result in astonishing success or terrible disaster. Troops and stores were steadily collected at Wadi Haifa and along the Nile. The new Camel Corps, consisting of 4 regiments, practiced their drills and evolutions. To pilot the boats up the cataracts, voyageurs were brought from Canada. At length, when all preparations were complete, the expedition started. The plan was simple. A strong column of infantry and boats was to work up the river. In case that should not arrive in time, the Camel Corps was to strike across the Bayuda Desert from Korti to Metemma. Having arrived there, a small detachment was to be thrown into Khartoum by Gordon's steamers to sustain the defense until the arrival of the main body in March or even April of 1885, when the town could be regularly relieved. The dramatic character of the enterprise and its picturesque and original features fascinated the nation, and the advance was watched with breathless interest. The fortunes of the river column have been graphically described by one who played no small part in their attempt. The Campaign of the Cataracts, by Sir William Butler, is a record of hard and unceasing toil. Day upon day, the long lines of soldiers hauled on the tow ropes or pulled at the oars of the broad-bottomed boats. Night after night they camped on the banks amid the grim desolation of the Monastir Desert. Yet their monotonous labors were encouraged by the knowledge that as soon as the bend of the river at Abu Hamed was reached, the strong north wind would carry them swiftly to Khartoum. And it seemed a strange and bitter irony that the order to turn back and the news that all had been in vain was announced to the troops on the very day when they had cleared the cataracts and were moving forward at 5 times their former speed. The Desert Column started from Korti on the 30th of December. Their strength did not exceed 1,100 officers and men, but they were the flower of the army. Dropping their communications, they set forth along the caravan route towards Metemma. The knowledge which we have since gained of the resources of the Mahdists enables the peril of their desperate venture to be fully appreciated. Although the dervishes were neither so well armed nor trained as at a later date, they were nearly as numerous and equally devoid of fear. Their tactics were more in accordance with modern conditions. Their fanaticism was at its height. The British force, on the other hand, was equipped with weapons scarcely comparable with those employed in the concluding campaigns. Instead of the powerful Lee Metford rifle, with its smokeless powder, its magazine action, and its absence of recoil, They were armed with the Martini Henry, which possessed none of these advantages. In place of the deadly Maxim, there was the Gardner gun, the very gun that jammed at Tamai and that jammed again at Abu Klea. The artillery was also in every respect inferior to that now in general use. Besides all this, the principles of fire discipline and of scientific musketry were new, little understood, and hardly admitted. Nevertheless, the Camel Corps went boldly forward and engaged an enemy whose destruction ultimately required the strength of a better armed and better instructed army 12 times as strong. On the 3rd of January, they reached Gakdul Wells. 100 miles of their march was accomplished. But they were now delayed by the necessity of escorting a second column of supplies to Gakdul, and after that until the arrival of reinforcements which raised their strength to 1,800 of all ranks. The interval was employed in building 2 small forts and establishing an advanced depot, nor was it until the 13th that the march was resumed. The number of camels was not sufficient for the necessities of the transport. The food of the camels was too poor for the work they had to perform. By the 16th, however, they had made 50 miles and approached the wells of Abu Klea. Here their further advance was disputed by the enemy. The news of the advance of the Desert Column had been duly reported to the Mahdi and his Arab generals. A small party of English, it was said, with camels and some cavalry, were coming swiftly to the rescue of the accursed city. Their numbers were few, scarce 2,000 men. How should they hope to prevail against the expected Mahdi and the conquering Ansar who had destroyed Hicks? They were mad, yet they should die. Not one should escape. The delay in the advance offered ample opportunity. A great force of Arabs was concentrated. Slatin relates how several thousand men under important emirs were detached from the army before Khartoum and marched northward eager for the slaughter of the enemies of God. At Metema, the main strength of the Jailan tribe was collected. With the reinforcements from Omdurman, the total force of the Arabs actually at hand was not less than 10,000, and behind were many thousands more. They permitted the little column to advance until their retreat, if defeated, was impossible, and then, confident of victory, offered battle near the wells of Abu Klea. The Camel Corps remained halted during the morning of the 16th and built a small fort, in which they placed their reserve of stores and made some arrangement for the reception of wounded. At 1 o'clock they moved leisurely forward, passed through the rocky defile which led into the valley of Abu Klea, and bivouacked. Early the next morning the force moved out in square formation and advanced upon the enemy. The most savage and bloody action ever fought in the Sudan by British troops followed. Notwithstanding the numbers and the valor of the Arabs, that they penetrated the square, and that they inflicted on the troops a loss of 9 officers and 65 men killed, and 9 officers and 85 men wounded, 10% of the entire force, they were driven from the field with great slaughter, and the Desert Column camped at the wells. On the morning of the 18th they rested, placed their wounded in the small fort they had built, and buried their dead. In the afternoon they continued their advance, marched all through the night, and, having covered 23 miles, halted exhausted, almost within sight of the river, at daylight on the 19th. Meanwhile, the enemy had again collected in great strength, and an effective rifle fire was opened on the column. Sir Herbert Stewart received the wound of which a few weeks later he died. The command devolved upon Sir Charles Wilson. The position was desperate. Water was running short. The Nile was only 4 miles away, but the column was impeded by their wounded and stores, and between the river and the thirsty men lay the Dervish army, infuriated by their losses and fully aware of the sore straits to which their astonishing enemy was now reduced. It now became necessary to divide the small force. Some must remain to guard the baggage and the wounded, the others must fight their way to the water. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 19th, 900 men left the hastily made Sariba and marched towards the river. Without their camels or those of the transport, they appeared insignificant, a mere speck on the broad plain of Metemmah. The dervishes hastened to clinch the matter. The square advances slowly and painfully over the stony ground, with frequent jerky halts to preserve order and to pick up the wounded. Little puffs of white smoke dot the distant sandhills. Here and there a gaudy flag waves defiantly. In front, the green tops of the palm trees by the Nile tantalize, but stimulate the soldiers. On the left, the great mud labyrinth of Metemmah stretches indefinitely. Suddenly, the firing stops. The low scrub in front is alive with the swarming figures of the enemy. All the flags dance forward together. Ragged white figures spring up in hundreds. Emirs on horses appear as if by magic. Everywhere are men running swiftly forward, waving their spears and calling upon the Prophet of God to speed their enterprise. The square halts. The weary men begin to fire with thoughtful care. The dervishes drop thickly. On then, children of the desert. You are so many, they are so few. They are worn with fatigue and their throats are parched. You have drunk deeply of the Nile. One rush will trample the accursed under the feet of the faithful. The charge continues. A bugle sounds in the waiting square. The firing stops. What is this? They lose heart. Their ammunition is exhausted. On then, and make an end. Again the smoke ripples along the line of bayonets and fire is reopened, this time at closer range and with far greater effect. The stubborn grandeur of the British soldier is displayed by desperate circumstances. The men shoot to hit. The attack crumbles. The emirs, horse and man, collapse. The others turn and walk, for they will not run, sullenly back towards the town. The square starts forward. The road to the river is open. With dusk the water is reached, and never have victors gained a more longed-for prize. The Nile is won. Gordon remains. Sir Charles Wilson, having collected his force, remained 3 days by the bank of the Nile before attempting any further advance on Khartoum. He has explained why this delay was necessary, to the satisfaction of most military critics. Nor is it easy to believe that men who have made such splendid efforts would have willingly lost a single moment. On the 4th day, he embarked on 2 of Gordon's steamers, which awaited the relieving column, and taking with him 20 British soldiers and a few bluejackets, set forth towards the Shabluka Gorge and the town that lay beyond. On the 27th of January, the rescuers came in sight of Khartoum and under the fire of the enemy. Many of their perilous adventures seemed to belong to romance rather than to reality. The tiny gimcrack boats, struggling with the strong stream of the cataract, running the gauntlet of the Arab guns, dropping disconsolately down the river with their terrible news, or wrecked and stranded on the sandbank. Stuart Wortley rowing to the camp before Metemmah for help, Beresford starting in the remaining steamer, the bursting of the boiler by a dervish shell, Bembo mending it in a single day, Wilson's rescue, and the return to the entrenchment at Gubat. But the scene that appeals to the imagination above all the others is that where, with both banks ablaze with musketry and artillery, the black smoke pouring through the shot holes in the funnels, the water rising in spurts from the bullets, the men who had come so far and braved so much stared at the palace roof and, seeing no flag flying, knew that all was over and that they had come too late. The news of the dervish defeats at Abu Klea and Abu Kru impelled the Mahdi to a desperate venture. The English were but 120 miles away. They were few, but victorious. It was difficult to say what force could stop such men. In spite of the wrath of the true God and the valor of Islam, they might prevail. The Mahdi depended on success for existence. The tremendous forces of fanaticism are exerted only in a forward direction. Retreat meant ruin. All must be staked on an immediate assault. And, besides, the moment was ripe. Thus the Arab chiefs reasoned, and wisely resolved to be reckless. Thus the night of the 25th of January arrived. The band played as usual in the evening. Gradually the shadows fell and it became dark. the hungry inhabitants betook themselves to bed. The anxious but indomitable commander knew that the crisis impended, and knew also that he was powerless to avert it. Perhaps he slept, satisfied that he had done his duty, and in the silence of the night the savage enemy crawled stealthily towards the town. The weary and disheartened sentinels, weakened by famine and tired of war, maintained a doubtful vigilance along the ramparts. The subsiding waters of the river had left a bare gap between the White Nile and the wall. Perhaps there was treachery besides. On a sudden, the loud explosion of musketry broke the stillness of the night and the slumbers of the people, and with a continual shouting, thousands of dervishes swarmed through the unprotected space and entered Khartoum. One mob of assailants made their way to the palace. Gordon came out to meet them. The whole courtyard was filled with wild, harlequin figures and sharp, glittering blades. He attempted a parley. "Where is your master, the Mahdi?" He knew his influence over native races. Perhaps he hoped to save the lives of some of the inhabitants. Perhaps in that supreme moment, imagination flashed another picture before his eyes, and he saw himself confronted with the false prophet of a false religion, confronted with the European prisoners who had denied their Lord, offered the choice of death or the Koran, saw himself facing that savage circle with a fanaticism equal to and a courage greater than their own, marching in all the pride of faith and with retorted scorn to a martyr's death. It was not to be. Mad with the joy of victory and religious frenzy, they rushed upon him and, while he disdained even to fire his revolver, stabbed him in many places. The body fell down the steps and lay, a twisted heap, at the foot. There it was decapitated. The head was carried to the Mahdi. The trunk was stabbed again and again by the infuriated creatures, till nothing but a shapeless bundle of torn flesh and bloody rags remained of what had been a great and famous man and the envoy of Her Britannic Majesty. The blood soaked into the ground and left a dark stain which was not immediately effaced. Slatin mentions that the Arabs used often to visit the place. Ohrwalder went himself, and more than 6 weeks after the capture of the town, saw black spots upon the steps, but they have all since been obliterated. Such, briefly, is the story of the fall of Khartoum and of the death of Gordon. The fact that the two steamers arrived only 2 days after the capture of the town has given color to the belief that, but for the 3 days' delay at Metemmah, the catastrophe might have been averted. This view appears incorrect. The Arabs had long held Khartoum at their mercy. They hoped indeed to compel its surrender by famine and to avoid an assault, which after their experience at El Obeid they knew must cost them dear. Gordon has stated in his journals that the town became defenseless by the middle of December. The arrival of 20 British soldiers and a few officers could not have materially affected the situation, could only in fact have increased the loss. Yet nearly everyone who reads the tale will wish, in spite of reason, that some help, however little, had reached the lonely man, that before the darkness fell he had grasped an English hand, and learned that his countrymen had not abandoned him, had not forgotten, would never forget. It may not be possible as yet to fix the exact place which Charles Gordon will occupy in English history. It is certainly a high one. Whether he will rank as a commander with Peterborough, Wolfe, and Olive, those who come after us must decide. We may, however, assert that he was a man of stainless honor and enduring courage, who in varied capacities displayed a fertile and abundant genius. He was careless alike of the honors and comforts of the world, and looked forward with firm faith to the rewards of a future state. The severity of his religion did not impair the amiability of his character. The uncertainty of his moods may have frequently affected the soundness of his opinions, but not often the justice of his actions. Gordon's statue, set up in the indignant grief of the nation in the space which is appropriated to the monuments of great captains by sea and land, claims the attention of the passer-by, not only because it is comparatively new, The figure, its pose, and its story are familiar even to the poorest citizens of London and to people from all parts of the United Kingdom. Serene among the noise of the traffic, as formerly in that of the battle, the famous general seemed still, with bowed head and thoughtful countenance, to revolve the problems of the dark Sudan, and, inattentive to the clamor of men, inquires what is acceptable to God. With the capture of the city and the death of the envoy, the reason for the expedition disappeared. It remained only to withdraw the troops. The stores which had been brought across the desert at a terrible cost were thrown hastily into the Nile. The battered steamers which had waited so long in Metemmah were hurriedly dismantled. The Camel Corps, their extraordinary efforts futile and their camels killed, marched back on foot to Korti. Their retreat was pressed by the exultant enemy. The river column, whose boats after months of labor had just cleared the cataracts, and who had gained a success at Kirbekan, were carried back swiftly by the strong current against which they had hopefully struggled. The whole expeditionary force, guards, Highlanders, sailors, hussars, Indian soldiers, Canadian voyageurs, mules, camels, and artillery, trooped back forlornly over the desert sands, and behind them the rising tide of barbarism followed swiftly until the whole vast region was submerged. For several months the garrison of Kassala under a gallant Egyptian maintained a desperate resistance, but at last famine forced them to surrender, and they shared the fate of the garrisons of El Obeid, Darfur, Sobat, Tokar, Sindkat, Sennar, and Khartoum. The evacuation of the Sudan was thus completed. End of chapter 2.